Your sister bought a house. When are you finally going to settle down, Claire? Margaret Bennett's voice carried easily across the Christmas dinner table, light enough to sound like a joke, sharp enough to land like a verdict, and every fork paused midair as if the entire room had been waiting for that line all evening. Claire Bennett felt the words before she processed them, a familiar tightening in her chest, the subtle burn behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the mulled wine she was holding. And she smiled because that was what she had trained herself to do over 38 years of being compared, measured, and quietly found lacking. The Bennett house glowed with holiday perfection, white lights wrapped neatly around the staircase railing, pine garlands draped over the mantel, stockings stitched with each family member's name in careful red thread, and in the corner the 8-foot fir tree stood proud and symmetrical, topped with the same porcelain angel Margaret had used since Claire was 10 years old. Emily sat to Margaret's right, radiant in a cream sweater, her diamond studs catching the light each time she tilted her head modestly while accepting congratulations about the 3-bedroom colonial she and her husband had just purchased in a quiet suburb 20 minutes away, a home with a 2-car garage, granite countertops, and a fenced yard big enough for future children. And Claire could feel the pride in the room bending toward her sister like a spotlight. Daniel Harper, Claire's husband of 6 years, reached gently for her hand. Beneath the table, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a small, steady reminder that she was not alone, and she squeezed back without looking at him because she refused to let anyone see that the question had touched something tender. Margaret leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine, her expression composed, almost amused, as though she had simply voiced what everyone else had been too polite to ask. And a cousin cleared his throat, while someone else laughed softly, the sound thin and uncertain, the kind of laughter people use when they want tension to disappear. Claire lifted her glass and took a slow sip, tasting cinnamon and citrus and something bittersweet beneath it, and she let the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional, not wounded. She noticed the way the candlelight flickered against the polished mahogany table, the way the silverware reflected distorted fragments of faces, the way her reflection in the window looked calm and composed, not like a woman who had spent the last 6 months reviewing mortgage documents, signing closing papers, and choosing paint samples for a house no one at this table knew existed. Margaret's gaze lingered on her, waiting for deflection or embarrassment or some self-deprecating joke. But Claire simply set her glass down with measured precision and folded her hands, her posture relaxed, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "I already did," she said, not louder than before, not dramatic, just clear enough to carry across the table, and the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a snow globe that had just been turned upside down and would take a moment for the flakes to settle. The words settled over the table more heavily than anyone expected, and for a moment even the crackle from the fireplace seemed too loud, as if the house itself was reacting to the shift. Margaret blinked first, her smile tightening at the corners while she studied Claire's face for signs of sarcasm. But there was none, only a calm steadiness that felt unfamiliar. Emily's hand paused halfway to her wine glass, her brows drawing together in polite confusion. Daniel did not release Claire's hand. Beneath the table, and that quiet gesture grounded her more than any explanation could. "What do you mean you already did?" Margaret asked lightly, but there was a faint strain beneath the question, the kind that appears when control slips unexpectedly. Claire did not rush to answer. She let the silence breathe, the way she had learned to do in meetings at work when executives underestimated her, and then had to reconsider. She looked around the table at the cousins, the aunt who always nodded along with Margaret, the uncle who preferred not to involve himself in family tension, and she realized that for the first time she did not feel small under their gaze. "Daniel and I bought a house in June," she said evenly. She did not embellish. She did not apologize. She did not laugh. The statement stood on its own. Emily's mouth parted slightly, surprise flashing across her face before she recovered. "You did?" she asked, almost incredulous. Margaret leaned back, folding her arms as if reassessing a story she had told herself for years. "You never mentioned anything," she replied, her tone measured now, cautious. Claire nodded once. "You never asked," she said, not sharply, not accusing, simply factual. The room absorbed that answer more slowly than the first. Daniel finally spoke, his voice warm but firm. "We wanted to finish renovations before we invited anyone over," he explained. "It is a small craftsman on Maple Ridge. About 15 minutes from here, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, built in 1952. It needed work, but it is ours." Claire could almost see the image forming in their minds. The wide front porch they had repainted themselves, the oak floors they had sanded on weekends, the kitchen cabinets Daniel had installed one careful hinge at a time. Margaret's expression shifted again, not anger, not pride, but something closer to recalibration. She reached for her glass, taking a sip as though buying time. "Well," she said after a moment, "that is good to know." The words were polite, but they did not carry the same authority they once had. Claire felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. She was not triumphant. She was simply steady. Across the table, Emily cleared her throat and forced a smile. "That is wonderful, Claire. You should have told us." Claire returned the smile, gentle and contained. "We wanted it to be ours first," she replied. And in that quiet declaration, something unspoken shifted between mother and daughter, not explosive, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a line that had finally been drawn without being announced. The conversation around the table resumed, but it no longer flowed with the same easy rhythm. Forks scraped against porcelain plates. Someone commented on the roasted turkey. Another reached for the cranberry sauce. Yet beneath the polite exchanges there was a quiet recalculating that Claire could almost hear. Margaret straightened the silverware beside her plate, as though restoring order to something that had shifted out of alignment. Her posture composed, but more attentive now, studying her eldest daughter in a way she had not done in years. Claire noticed the change without staring at it. She kept her shoulders relaxed and her tone neutral as she answered small questions about square footage and neighborhood schools, explaining that the house measured just under 1,800 square feet, that the roof had been replaced 3 years earlier, that the backyard faced west, so the sunset poured through the kitchen windows each evening. She spoke without defensiveness, without boasting, simply laying out facts the way one might describe the weather. Emily listened carefully, nodding, her earlier confidence softened into something more reflective. "Maple Ridge is a good area," she admitted, and the acknowledgement hung in the air like a subtle concession. Daniel added a few details about refinishing the hardwood floors and installing new light fixtures, his voice steady and supportive, never overshadowing Claire, never claiming credit. Margaret cleared her throat, folding her napkin neatly across her lap. "I just want you to be secure," she said, the words quieter now, stripped of their earlier edge. Claire met her mother's eyes across the table, holding the gaze without challenge. "I am secure," she replied, and she meant more than the mortgage approval or the updated electrical wiring. She meant the evenings spent reviewing spreadsheets at the dining room table in their temporary apartment, the early Saturday mornings driving to hardware stores, the careful budgeting that allowed them to replace old windows one at a time instead of all at once. She meant the calm she felt walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon cleaner, knowing every improvement had come from deliberate effort rather than comparison. Around them, the tree lights blinked softly, reflecting in the window like distant stars, and Claire realized how many Christmas dinners she had sat at this same table feeling measured against milestones she had not yet reached. This year felt different not because she had proven something, but because she no longer needed to. Margaret looked down at her plate before glancing back up. "You should have told me," she said again, though the accusation had faded into something closer to regret. Claire considered that for a moment, then answered gently. "I wanted to tell you when it felt like good news, not a defense." And the honesty in her voice was steady, not sharp. No one argued with that. Conversation slowly regained its balance, but the hierarchy had shifted in a way that did not require announcement. Claire picked up her fork and finally began to eat, tasting the rosemary and garlic, feeling the warmth settle into her, aware that something fundamental had changed, not in the room's decorations or the family traditions, but in the quiet confidence with which she now occupied her seat at the table. After dinner plates were cleared and dessert was set out on small white dishes, the evening shifted into the softer rhythm of tradition, cousins drifting toward the living room, someone turning on low instrumental carols, the fire settling into steady orange embers. Claire stood near the edge of the room, holding a cup of coffee, watching the familiar choreography unfold, noticing how naturally everyone resumed their roles. Yet something inside her no longer aligned with the script. Daniel joined a conversation about interest rates and property taxes, explaining how they had locked in a fixed 30-year mortgage at a reasonable rate before the market climbed higher, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, and Claire felt a quiet appreciation for the partnership they had built without applause. Across the room, Margaret adjusted ornaments on the tree, a small habitual gesture whenever she needed to think. And for a moment Claire saw not just the critical mother, but the woman who had spent decades measuring success in visible milestones because that was the language she understood. Memory moved through Claire gently, not bitterly, recalling earlier holidays when she had arrived alone, carrying store-bought cookies and fielding subtle questions about promotions, relationships, timelines. She remembered nodding politely while Emily described engagement rings and neighborhood open houses, remembered the way her mother's praise always tilted slightly in one direction, never cruel, but consistent enough to sting. Tonight felt different because Claire was no longer waiting to be recognized. She had already recognized herself. Margaret approached slowly, her coffee cup held close as if for warmth. Maple Ridge, she repeated thoughtfully, as though testing the sound of it. Claire nodded, describing the old maple tree in the front yard that turned deep red each October. The narrow staircase with its original banister. The small office she had painted a muted blue for remote work. She did not dramatize the months of sanding and budgeting, the evenings spent choosing between replacing the dishwasher or repairing the back fence. She spoke simply, and the simplicity carried weight. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression less guarded now. "I suppose I worried you were drifting," she admitted quietly. Claire considered the word and felt its past sting soften. "I was building," she replied. Not defensive, just clear. The admission settled between them, and Margaret's shoulders eased slightly, as if some unspoken tension had finally been named. Laughter rose from the living room as Emily opened a gift, but it no longer felt like a comparison echoing through the walls. It felt like background noise to a new understanding taking shape. Claire glanced at Daniel, who caught her eye and smiled with quiet pride. She realized that the house on Maple Ridge was not just square footage and renovated floors. It was evidence of choices made without seeking approval, of stability defined on her own terms. As the evening continued, Claire no longer felt the need to anticipate judgment. She stood where she was, steady and unhurried, aware that the true shift had not been the announcement itself but the calm with which she had delivered it. Later that evening, when coats were pulled from the hallway closet and goodbyes began echoing through the entryway, Claire felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest, not because she had corrected anyone, but because she had finally stopped defending herself against a story that no longer fit. Snow had begun to fall outside, thin and steady, dusting the front lawn and softening the edges of the driveway, and the porch light cast a warm circle onto the quiet street. Daniel stepped out ahead of her to start the car, brushing a light layer of snow from the windshield with deliberate strokes, while Claire lingered inside for one last exchange. Margaret stood by the door, fingers resting on the brass handle, her expression thoughtful rather than critical. "I did not mean to embarrass you," she said, and the sentence felt different from earlier ones, stripped of performance. Claire studied her mother's face, noticing the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the fatigue that came from carrying expectations for so many years. "I know," Claire replied gently, and she did. She understood now that comparison had been Margaret's way of measuring safety in a world that valued visible milestones. Margaret hesitated, then added, "I am proud of you. You know, I just did not always know how to say it." The words were quiet, almost tentative, and Claire realized that pride had been present all along, just filtered through a language of pressure. She reached forward and adjusted her scarf, giving herself a second before answering. "You can just say it," she said with a faint smile. Margaret nodded once, as if learning something simple but overdue. Outside, the cold air met Claire's face with a clean, bracing clarity, and she walked toward the car without hurry. As Daniel pulled away from the curb, the house behind them glowed against the snow, familiar and unchanged, yet Claire felt different leaving it. She rested her head lightly against the seat and watched the quiet neighborhood pass by, Christmas lights blinking from rooftops, wreaths hanging in orderly rows, the world steady and ordinary. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked softly. Claire nodded. "I am," she answered, and this time there was no undercurrent beneath the words. She thought about the maple tree on their own front lawn, about the porch light she had left on earlier that evening, about the scent of fresh pine from the wreath she had hung on their own door. The road curved toward Maple Ridge, tires humming gently over the thin layer of snow, and Claire felt a calm certainty settle over her. She had not needed to argue, and she had not needed to prove. She had simply stated a fact and allowed it to stand. When they turned into their driveway, the small craftsman house welcomed them with warm yellow lights spilling through the front windows, and Claire understood that settling down had never been about matching someone else's timeline. It had been about standing firmly in her own, and tonight she had done exactly that. The house on Maple Ridge felt different that night, quieter than usual, as if it had been waiting for them to return with something resolved. Claire stepped inside first, closing the door gently behind her, the faint scent of pine from their wreath mixing with the clean smell of fresh paint that still lingered in the hallway. She slipped off her boots and stood for a moment on the oak floors they had sanded themselves, remembering how uneven they had been in July, how she had worried the imperfections would never smooth out. Daniel locked the door and adjusted the thermostat up a degree, the furnace humming softly to life, and the ordinary sound grounded her more than any holiday conversation could. She walked into the living room, where their modest 6-foot tree stood near the front window, decorated with simple white lights and a handful of ornaments they had collected over the years. Nothing elaborate, nothing coordinated, but entirely theirs. She ran her fingers lightly along the back of the sofa, recalling the evening they had debated whether to replace it or save for new kitchen appliances instead, choosing practicality over appearance without resentment. Daniel joined her with 2 mugs of chamomile tea, handing one to her without ceremony. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Claire nodded, taking a slow sip, feeling warmth spread through her hands. "I did not feel the need to defend myself," she answered, and the truth of that realization surprised her. Slightly, she moved toward the kitchen, glancing at the half-installed cabinet hardware waiting to be finished after the holidays, at the stack of paint samples still tucked into a drawer, at the small notebook on the counter filled with measured plans and expense calculations. Every detail represented patience rather than performance. She remembered how many times she had felt behind, as though adulthood were a race with invisible checkpoints. Each one announced loudly when Emily reached it. First, tonight, standing in a kitchen that still needed finishing touches, she felt ahead in a way that had nothing to do with comparison. Daniel rested his hand on the countertop and looked around with quiet satisfaction. "We built this slowly," he said. Claire smiled faintly. "We built it deliberately," she corrected, and that distinction mattered. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft, steady flakes, coating the front porch and settling on the maple tree branches. She walked to the window and watched the street grow silent. The world simplified into white and gold light. Earlier that evening, her mother's words had echoed like a judgment. Now they felt distant, almost instructional, a reminder of how easily expectations could shape perception. Claire turned off the living room lamp and headed toward the staircase, her steps unhurried. This house was not grand, not new, not something that would impress a crowd at a dinner table, but it carried the quiet confidence of earned stability. As she reached the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back down at the space they had claimed as their own, understanding that the real shift had not occurred during a single sentence at Christmas dinner, but in the calm certainty that followed her home, steady and unshakable. Morning arrived slowly over Maple Ridge, pale winter light slipping through the bedroom curtains and stretching across the hardwood floors in thin, quiet lines. Claire woke before the alarm, not out of worry but out of habit, her mind clear in a way it had not been after past holidays. She lay still for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the furnace and the distant sound of a snowplow clearing the main road, and she realized that the tension she once carried home from family gatherings had not followed her this time. Daniel stirred beside her and reached for her hand without opening his eyes, the gesture familiar and grounding. She squeezed his fingers lightly before rising, wrapping a soft gray robe around her shoulders and moving downstairs. The kitchen felt calm and honest in the early light. Unfinished cabinet hardware catching a faint glow. The small dining table bearing the faint marks of late-night planning sessions from months before. She started the coffee maker and stood by the sink, watching the backyard where snow had settled evenly across the fence line and the branches of the maple tree. The yard was modest, not expansive, but it was enough. Enough space for a garden in spring, enough room for a simple patio set they planned to buy once the budget allowed. She remembered how often she had measured her life against larger lawns and newer constructions, how easily comparison had slipped into quiet self-doubt. Now, standing in a kitchen that required patience rather than presentation, she felt steadier than she ever had in polished spaces designed to impress. Her phone buzzed softly on the counter, a message from Margaret reading. Simply, "I have been thinking about last night." Claire did not rush to respond. She poured her coffee into a ceramic mug with a small chip along the rim, the one she refused to discard because it reminded her of resilience rather than perfection. Daniel joined her moments later, hair still tousled, and kissed her cheek in passing before opening the refrigerator to check the leftover pie. "You slept well?" he observed. She nodded. "I did," she answered honestly. The house held no echo of judgment, only the quiet rhythm of two people building something deliberately. She glanced again at the message from her mother and typed back slowly, "I am glad we talked." The reply came a few minutes later, shorter than she expected. "I am learning." Claire set the phone down and exhaled softly. Learning did not erase years of comparison, but it acknowledged them. She walked to the front window and watched sunlight begin to melt the thin layer of snow along the sidewalk, revealing the steady ground beneath. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to prove her direction or defend her pace. She had chosen it. And as the morning settled fully over Maple Ridge, Claire understood that security was not granted by applause around a holiday table, but earned quietly in moments exactly like this, ordinary and unremarkable, yet deeply her own. The rest of the week unfolded with a quiet steadiness that surprised Claire. The snow along Maple Ridge melted gradually, revealing damp grass and the edges of the walkway Daniel had shoveled before leaving for work each morning, and the rhythm of ordinary life resumed without ceremony. On Wednesday afternoon, while Claire was reviewing a report at the small blue desk in her home office, her phone rang with Margaret's name glowing on the screen. She let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation but out of composure. "Hello, Mom," she said evenly. Margaret's voice carried none of its usual brisk certainty. Instead, there was a softness that sounded almost unfamiliar. "I was wondering if Daniel and you would like to have me over this weekend," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I would like to see your house." Claire glanced around the office, at the neatly stacked folders. The modest bookshelf Daniel had mounted level after 3 attempts, the framed photograph of the two of them standing in front of the maple tree on closing day. "You are welcome anytime," she replied, and she meant it. When Saturday arrived, the sky was clear and bright, the temperature hovering just above freezing, and Claire stood at the front window watching Margaret's sedan pull into the driveway. She felt no flutter of anxiety, only a calm readiness. Daniel opened the door before Margaret reached the porch. Greeting her warmly and taking her coat, Margaret stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the entryway, the refinished floors, the simple coat rack Claire had assembled herself. "It feels comfortable," she said, almost to herself. Claire led her through the living room, explaining how they had preserved the original trim, how they planned to repaint the exterior in the spring, how the backyard would look once the snow fully melted. Margaret paused in the kitchen, running her fingers lightly along the countertop as if measuring its sturdiness. "You did this yourselves," she observed. Daniel nodded. "Most of it," he answered. Margaret's expression shifted again, not skeptical this time but reflective. They moved toward the staircase, and Claire pointed out the guest room, modest but bright, with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "You could stay here sometime," Claire offered, the invitation sincere and unforced. Margaret looked around slowly, taking in the framed prints on the walls, the faint scent of coffee lingering from earlier that morning, the steady warmth of the house. "You have built something solid," she said quietly. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of recognition Claire had not known she still wanted. She nodded once. meeting her mother's gaze without triumph or defensiveness. Outside, sunlight filtered through the maple branches, casting patterned shadows across the front lawn. Inside, 3 people stood in a house that was not large, not new, not designed for admiration, but grounded in deliberate effort. Claire felt no urge to justify a single detail. She simply let her mother see it as it was, understanding that sometimes the strongest statement was not spoken at a crowded holiday table, but demonstrated quietly in daylight, room by room, without comparison. Margaret stayed longer than she had planned that Saturday, lingering in the kitchen while Daniel adjusted a loose hinge on one of the upper cabinets, the quiet tapping of his screwdriver steady and unhurried. Claire poured fresh coffee and set out a small plate of shortbread cookies, noticing how natural the gesture felt in her own home, how different it was from standing in her mother's dining room waiting for approval. Margaret walked slowly toward the living room window and looked out at the maple tree, its bare branches stretching cleanly against the pale blue sky. "You always did like trees," she said, almost absent-mindedly. Claire smiled faintly, remembering childhood afternoons spent climbing the old oak in their former backyard, while Emily preferred ballet lessons and piano recitals. "I like watching something grow at its own pace," she replied. Margaret turned back toward her, studying her face with a thoughtful expression. "I may have pushed too hard sometimes," she admitted. Her tone measured. "I thought comparison would motivate you." Claire leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, arms relaxed, not defensive. "It motivated me," she answered calmly. "Just not in the way you expected." The words were not sharp. They carried no accusation. They simply acknowledged a truth both of them could now see more clearly. Daniel stepped away from the cabinet and joined them, wiping his hands on a cloth. "We learned to build quietly," he said with an easy smile. Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing that. She walked through the house once more, pausing in the small office, running her fingers over the edge of the blue desk. "You seem settled," she observed. Claire felt the weight of that word again, but this time it landed differently, not as a demand but as recognition. "I am," she said. There was no need to elaborate, no need to describe long evenings spent balancing spreadsheets or weekends spent replacing baseboards. The steadiness of her voice carried more than details ever could. When Margaret finally gathered her coat, she paused at the front door and looked back into the living room, where sunlight filtered through the window and illuminated the quiet order of the space. "I am glad you did not rush," she said softly. Claire understood that the sentence meant more than timing. It meant she had not rushed into someone else's expectations. She had not shaped her life to fit applause. Outside, the afternoon air felt crisp but no longer harsh. As Margaret drove away, Claire stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the clean scent of winter, aware that something subtle had shifted not only in her mother but within herself. She walked back inside, closing the door gently, and felt no lingering tension, only the steady comfort of walls that held her choices without judgment. Daniel wrapped an arm loosely around her shoulders, and she leaned into the warmth without needing to say anything at all. In the weeks that followed, life on Maple Ridge settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than assumed. Mornings began with the steady hum of the coffee maker and the soft glow of winter light across the kitchen floor. Afternoons carried the quiet focus of work calls from Claire's blue-painted office, and evenings ended with small, deliberate tasks that slowly transformed the house from renovation project into home. One Tuesday night, as Claire reviewed the monthly budget at the dining table, Daniel joined her with a stack of receipts from the hardware store, placing them neatly beside her notebook without commentary. She appreciated that about him. The way he participated without competing, the way their partnership felt balanced instead of performative. "We can order the new light fixtures next month," he said calmly, glancing at the spreadsheet. Claire nodded, adjusting a column of numbers. "There is no rush," she replied. She had learned that stability did not demand spectacle. It required patience. Later that week, Margaret called again, not to question, not to compare, but to ask how the backyard might look in spring. The shift in tone was subtle but steady. Claire described plans for raised garden beds along the fence line and a simple wooden bench beneath the maple tree. She did not exaggerate the vision. She spoke of it as something unfolding rather than something to display. "It sounds peaceful," Margaret said quietly. Claire realized then that her mother's earlier urgency had always been rooted in fear, fear that drifting meant failing, fear that delay meant loss. But here, in this modest house with its measured improvements and gradual progress, Claire had proven that time did not equate to absence. It equated to intention. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel installed the final cabinet handle while Claire organized a small bookshelf in the living room, arranging novels and framed photographs with quiet care. When the last screw tightened into place, Daniel stepped back and surveyed the kitchen, not proudly, but thoughtfully. "It feels finished," he said. Claire looked around, noticing the even lines, the clean surfaces, the warmth of afternoon sunlight stretching across the counter. Finished did not mean flawless. It meant sufficient. She walked to the front window and watched children from a neighboring house ride bicycles slowly along the sidewalk, their laughter faint but steady. This neighborhood was not grand, not curated for admiration, but it held a grounded simplicity she valued. That evening, as she placed a small lamp on the side table and switched it on, casting a soft amber glow through the room, she understood that the true measure of settling down was not visible in square footage or granite countertops. It was visible in the absence of restlessness. She felt no urgency to announce another milestone, no need to accelerate her pace to match someone else's. She stood in the center of her living room, listening to the quiet hum of a house that reflected her choices, and knew that for the first time in years, her direction required no explanation at all. By early spring, the maple tree outside their front window began to show the first signs of change, small red buds forming at the tips of bare branches, subtle but undeniable. Claire noticed them one morning while rinsing her coffee mug, the sunlight catching the glass and casting soft reflections across the kitchen wall. Change did not arrive loudly. It revealed itself in small increments. Much like the shift that had taken place between her and her mother, one afternoon, Margaret arrived, unannounced but not unwelcome, carrying a small paper bag from the local nursery. "For your garden," she said, placing it carefully on the kitchen counter. Inside were seed packets, tomatoes, basil, and a variety of wildflowers Claire had once mentioned liking. The gesture was modest, but it carried intention. Claire thanked her and began clearing a space on the counter, aware that this visit felt different from the first. There was no inspection in Margaret's eyes this time, only observation. They walked together into the backyard where the snow had fully melted, leaving behind damp soil and patches of early green. Daniel joined them briefly, measuring the length of the fence for the raised beds he planned to build over the weekend, then excused himself to retrieve a tape measure from the garage. Claire knelt near the fence line, pressing her palm lightly against the earth, testing its readiness. Margaret stood beside her, hands folded, watching without instruction. "You always were patient," she said quietly. Claire glanced up, brushing soil from her fingertips. "I had to learn to be," she replied. The air carried the faint scent of thawing ground and distant cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Margaret bent slightly to look closer at the soil, her movements slower now but deliberate. "I thought pushing would prepare you," she admitted. "I did not realize it made you doubt yourself." Claire paused before answering. Considering the honesty in that confession, "It made me work harder," she said. "But it also made me quiet." The words were not bitter, they were reflective. Margaret nodded once, absorbing the distinction. Daniel returned with the tape measure and crouched near Claire, discussing dimensions for the first raised bed, calculating how many boards they would need. Margaret listened without interrupting her presence, no longer directing but supporting. As they stood together in the backyard, measuring and planning beneath the slowly budding maple tree, Claire felt something settle fully into place. Not validation, not triumph, but alignment. The comparison that once hovered between sisters, between expectations and timelines, no longer held weight here. This patch of ground, soon to hold seeds and steady growth, belonged to her choices. When Margaret finally left that afternoon, she paused at the gate and looked back at the yard. "It will be beautiful," she said softly. Claire believed her, not because of approval, but because she understood now that growth, whether in soil or in family, required time, space, and the quiet courage to define success on one's own terms. By late April, the raised garden bed stood firmly along the fence line. clean cedar boards forming neat rectangles against the dark soil, and Claire found herself waking earlier on weekends just to step outside with a cup of coffee and check the small green shoots pushing through the earth. The tomato plants had begun to rise steadily, thin stems strengthening each day, and the basil released a faint, clean scent when brushed lightly by her fingertips. Daniel installed a simple wooden bench beneath the maple tree one Saturday afternoon, tightening the final bolt with quiet satisfaction before stepping back to examine the balance. Claire watched him from the porch, sunlight catching in his hair, and felt the steady comfort of a life built without spectacle. That evening, Margaret arrived with Emily, who had not yet visited the house since Christmas. Emily stepped through the front door slowly, her eyes scanning the living room. The refinished floors, the understated decor. There was no envy in her expression, only curiosity. They walked together into the backyard where early blossoms had begun to appear in the flower bed, small but vibrant. "It feels peaceful here," Emily said softly, as if surprised by her own observation. Claire nodded, kneeling to adjust the soil around a young plant. "It is," she replied. Margaret stood beside the maple tree, looking upward at its newly formed leaves. The tension that once accompanied their gatherings had thinned, replaced by a quieter awareness. Daniel offered lemonade from the kitchen, handing glasses around without ceremony, and they sat together on the porch steps, sunlight warming the wood beneath them. Conversation drifted from garden plans to work projects to simple neighborhood stories. There was no comparison woven into the exchange, no subtle weighing of milestones. Claire noticed the difference not because it was dramatic, but because it was absent. Later, as the evening lights softened and shadows stretched across the lawn, Margaret turned to Claire with a steady gaze. "I see you clearly now," she said, her voice calm. Claire did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to settle without urgency. She understood that clarity did not erase the past, but it reframed it. "I have always been here," Claire answered gently. Margaret nodded once, accepting the simplicity of that truth. As the sun dipped lower behind the houses along Maple Ridge, casting warm gold across the yard, Claire felt a quiet alignment within herself. The house no longer represented a point to prove or a milestone to defend. It represented a rhythm chosen deliberately, step by measured step. When the evening ended and her family prepared to leave, there were no unfinished sentences lingering in the air, no comparisons left unspoken. Claire stood on the porch watching the car pull away, then turned back toward the garden, toward the maple tree, toward the home that had grown alongside her. She understood now that settling down had never been about meeting expectations on a specific timeline. It had been about standing firmly in her own direction and allowing others to see it when they were ready. May arrived with longer evenings and the steady hum of lawn mowers drifting through the neighborhood, and Claire found herself spending more time outdoors, tending to the raised beds with a quiet focus that felt almost meditative. The tomato plants had thickened, their stems sturdy enough to support small clusters of green fruit, and the basil leaves spread wide and fragrant beneath her fingertips. One Saturday morning, she carried a basket outside to gather the first modest harvest of lettuce, brushing soil from the roots before rinsing them in the kitchen sink. Daniel stood nearby chopping vegetables for lunch. The window above the sink opened just enough to let in a breeze. "It is working," he said softly, glancing toward the garden. Claire nodded, placing the rinsed leaves into a bowl. She understood that he was not only speaking about the vegetables. Later that afternoon, Margaret called again. Her voice brighter than usual, she asked about the progress of the garden, about whether the bench beneath the maple tree was comfortable in the evenings, about whether Claire needed help choosing flowers for the front yard. The questions no longer carried instruction. They carried curiosity. Claire answered each one with calm clarity, describing how the backyard filled with soft light at sunset, how the cedar boards of the raised beds had already begun to weather slightly in the sun. She realized that her mother's tone no longer triggered an instinct to defend. It invited conversation. That evening, Daniel set the small patio table near the bench, and they ate their salad outside. Simple plates balanced carefully on the wood. Neighbors walked past with friendly waves, children's laughter carrying faintly from down the block. Claire leaned back slightly and let the quiet settle around her. She thought of the holiday table months earlier, of the flicker of candlelight and the weight of comparison that had once felt so familiar. Now, sitting beneath the maple tree with the scent of basil lingering in the air, she felt something steadier than validation. She felt ownership of her pace. Daniel reached across the table and adjusted the position of a candle so it would not tip in the breeze. The gesture was small, thoughtful, unspoken. Claire watched the flame steady itself again and understood that this was what settling down truly meant. Not the approval of others, not the timing of milestones, but the ability to stand firmly in choices made deliberately. As twilight deepened and the sky shifted from pale blue to muted violet, she glanced toward the front of the house, where soft interior lights glowed through the windows. There was no rush to expand, no urgency to impress. The garden would grow at its own rate. The maple tree would thicken its branches over years, and her relationship with her mother would continue adjusting in quiet increments. Claire felt no need to announce any of it. She simply remained seated beneath the tree, aware that the strongest transformations often happened without spectacle, steady and undeniable, like roots deepening beneath the surface. By early June, the backyard no longer looked like a project. It looked lived in. The tomato plants had begun to blush faintly at the edges, promising ripeness in the coming weeks, and the basil had grown tall enough that Claire clipped small bunches regularly, tying them with twine and hanging them in the kitchen to dry. The maple tree cast a fuller shade now, its leaves dense and steady, filtering the late afternoon sunlight into soft patterns across the grass. One Sunday, Margaret arrived carrying a small folding chair in the trunk of her car, insisting she preferred to sit near the garden rather than on the porch. Claire noticed the detail quietly. It was not a grand gesture, but it meant her mother intended to stay a while. Daniel was assembling a simple bird feeder he had purchased from a local hardware store, placing it near the fence where sparrows had already begun to gather. The yard carried the gentle hum of summer beginning. Insects faint in the air, distant lawn mowers fading into background noise. Margaret watched Claire kneel beside the raised bed, her hands steady as she loosened soil around a growing plant. "You do not rush anything," Margaret observed. There was no criticism in her voice, only curiosity. Claire wiped her hands on a gardening cloth and sat back on her heels. "I used to think I was behind," she admitted calmly. "Now I think I was just early in different ways." Margaret considered that for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the house, toward the porch where a small American flag fluttered lightly beside the railing. "I measured you by someone else's timeline," she said softly. Claire met her eyes without tension. "I know," she replied, and she did. Understanding had replaced resentment. Daniel stepped over and placed the finished bird feeder onto its hook, tightening it securely. Within minutes, a small bird landed cautiously on the edge, testing its balance. All three of them watched in quiet stillness. It was a simple moment, unremarkable to anyone passing by, yet it felt complete. Later, as the sun dipped lower and painted the sky with warm gold, Claire poured iced tea into tall glasses and handed one to her mother. They sat side by side beneath the maple tree, the bench steady beneath them. There were no comparisons left between sisters, no invisible scoreboard hovering in conversation, only shared observation of growth, of patience, of time unfolding without urgency. Margaret glanced at Claire and gave a small nod, not of approval, but of recognition. Claire did not need applause. She did not need reassurance. She felt the quiet weight of her choices anchoring her to this yard, to this house, to this steady season. As evening settled across Maple Ridge and porch lights flickered on along the street, she understood that the real transformation had not been announced at a crowded holiday table. It had been cultivated slowly, like the garden before her, through intention, resilience, and the decision to stand firm in her own direction. July settled over Maple Ridge with a steady warmth that lingered well into the evenings, and Claire began leaving the windows open to let the scent of basil and cut grass drift through the house. The tomatoes had finally ripened into a deep red, their skins smooth and firm beneath her fingertips as she gathered them into a woven basket one quiet Saturday morning. Daniel was trimming the edges of the lawn with careful precision, the low hum of the trimmer blending with distant neighborhood sounds, and Claire felt a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of it all. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived alone. carrying a small container of homemade lemonade and a hesitant smile. She walked slowly through the gate into the backyard, her eyes lingering on the raised beds and the bench beneath the maple tree. "It looks different every time I come," she said softly, kneeling beside Claire to examine a cluster of tomatoes. There was no comparison in her tone, only acknowledgement. Claire handed her one of the ripest fruits, still warm from the sun, and watched as Emily turned it over in her hands. "I used to think you were unsure," Emily admitted after a moment. "I did not realize you were just building something quieter." Claire wiped her hands on a cloth and sat back on her heels, considering the statement without resentment. "Quiet does not mean uncertain," she replied gently. Daniel joined them with 3 glasses of lemonade. Setting them on the small patio table, the 3 of them sat beneath the tree, sunlight filtering through the leaves in soft, shifting patterns. Conversation moved easily, touching on work projects, weekend plans, simple neighborhood stories. There was no invisible measure between sisters, no silent tally of achievements. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, Margaret arrived briefly with a basket of fresh peaches from a roadside stand, placing them on the kitchen counter before stepping outside to join them. She looked around the yard, the garden thriving, the bird feeder now regularly visited by small finches, and her expression carried quiet contentment. "It suits you," she said to Claire, gesturing lightly toward the house and garden. Claire understood that she meant more than the physical space. She meant the steadiness, the absence of urgency. As the sky deepened into warm shades of orange and violet, Claire leaned back against the bench and listened to the soft murmur of conversation around her. She felt no need to assert herself, no need to clarify her direction. The transformation had long since settled into something stable. This house, this garden, this pace were not declarations. They were evidence. And as fireflies began to flicker faintly at the edge of the yard, Claire recognized that the greatest shift had not been convincing anyone else. It had been trusting herself enough to let her life unfold without defense.